They called her the biggest joke West Texas had ever seen. A woman the whole town mocked, forced into a marriage with a debt-ridden cowboy. No one believed the marriage would last past the first summer. But what they didn't know was, the woman they ridiculed was quietly building an empire no enemy could destroy. This is a story of resilience, intelligence, and true strength coming from the most unexpected places. Watch until the end, and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has come. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Colt Mercer would later think was fitting because nothing good had ever happened to him on a Tuesday. He was elbow deep in the belly of a dead calf when his foreman, Wick Hoskins, came trudging across the dirt yard with the envelope held out like it might bite him. "Came by rider," Wick said, "from Judge Pemberton's office." Colt pulled his arm free, wiped the blood and birth fluid on his thigh, and took the envelope with hands that still stank of amniotic failure. The calf had been breech. He'd spent 40 minutes trying to turn it. The mother was standing 6 feet away, lowing at nothing, already forgetting. He tore the paper open and read it twice because the first time the words didn't make any sense, and the second time they made too much sense. "Well?" Wick asked. "They're calling in the note," Colt said. "All of it. $1,600 due in 90 days. Wick took off his hat and looked at the sky the way old men do when they're trying not to say something they'll regret. He was 53, sun-cracked, bow-legged, and had been working Mercer land since Colt's father was alive. He'd watched the ranch shrink from 4,000 head to barely 600. He'd watched the wells dry up one by one. He'd watched Colt's old man drink himself into a pine box and leave a 22-year-old kid holding a deed that was worth less than the paper it was printed on. 1,600, Wick said. Might as well ask for the moon. Pemberton knows that. So what's the play? Colt looked at the dead calf, then at the mother, then at the brown hills rolling south toward nothing. 3 years he'd been running this place. 3 years of patching fences with wire he couldn't afford, feeding cattle on grass that barely grew, and borrowing money from men who smiled at him the way a coyote smiles at a rabbit. "I don't know," he said. And he meant it. The play, as it turned out, came to him 3 days later in the back office of the Carrizo Springs Land and Cattle Association, which was a fancy name for a room that smelled like tobacco spit and old leather. Judge Asa Pemberton sat behind a desk that was too big for the room, flanked by 2 men Colt had learned to hate, with a patience that surprised even himself. The first was Harlan Gull, who owned more land in Dimmitt County than any single man should, and who had been buying up failed ranches the way some men collected pocket watches. The second was Cyrus Braddock, who ran the Carrizo Springs Bank and had the kind of face that made you check your pockets after shaking his hand. "Sit down, son," Pemberton said, gesturing to a chair that was deliberately shorter than the others in the room. Colt sat. He didn't miss the height difference. He'd stopped being surprised by these small cruelties a long time ago. "You read my letter," Pemberton said. "I did." "Then you understand the situation." "The situation is you're squeezing me out. That's not complicated." Pemberton leaned back and laced his fingers over his belly. He was a large man, not fat exactly, but padded with the kind of comfortable weight that comes from never missing a meal and never doing a day's honest labor. His mustache was waxed. His boots had never touched cow manure. "Nobody's squeezing you, Colt. The note is due. That's business." "The note was due in 18 months. You moved it up. There's a provision in the contract that allows acceleration in the event of material deterioration of the collateral. Your herd count is down 40% from when the loan was originated. Your wells are dry. You lost 11 head to blackleg last month because you couldn't afford the vaccine." Pemberton spread his hands. "That's deterioration, son. That's arithmetic." Colt felt the heat crawl up the back of his neck, but he kept his voice level. His father had taught him one useful thing before the whiskey took over. Never let them see you sweat. The minute they smell fear, they own you. "What do you want, Judge?" Pemberton glanced at Gull, who hadn't spoken yet. Gull was leaner than Pemberton, harder, with a jaw like a shovel blade and eyes that did arithmetic constantly, pricing everything they landed on. "There's an option," Gull said. His voice was flat, almost bored. "A way to satisfy the debt and keep your land." "I'm listening." "Marriage." The word sat in the room like a dropped plate. "Excuse me?" Colt said. Gull didn't blink. "You know Desmond Holloway. Had a spread up past Eagle Pass before the drought finished him. Died last winter, left behind a daughter." "I know who Desmond Holloway was. What's that got to do with—" "His daughter, Maeve, inherited what's left. Some cattle, mineral rights on about 200 acres, a modest sum in the bank. Nothing that would make anyone rich, but enough to satisfy your note and give your operation some breathing room." Gull paused, and something moved across his face that might have been amusement. "She also inherited her father's stubbornness, which nobody wants. You're asking me to marry a woman I've never met to pay off a debt." "I'm offering you a lifeline," Gull said. "The Holloway girl needs a husband. She can't manage those mineral rights alone. Not legally, not practically. And you need capital. It's a clean arrangement." Colt looked at Braddock, who had been sitting silently with his fingers steepled. "And what's in it for you three?" Braddock smiled. It was the pocket-checking smile. "Stability, Colt. A married couple with combined assets is a better risk than a single young man running a failing ranch. We extend the note, you get your feet under you, everybody wins." "Everybody wins," Colt repeated. "Right." He didn't believe a word of it. These men didn't do charity. They didn't do kindness. Everything they touched had teeth in it somewhere, and the teeth always pointed inward. But he was 22 years old with a dying ranch and a dead calf and no other cards to play, so he said the only thing he could say. "When do I meet her?" He met her 4 days later on the porch of the Holloway property outside Eagle Pass, and the first thing he noticed was that the porch was clean. Not just swept, but scrubbed, with the boards recently oiled and the railing patched with new wood that hadn't weathered yet. The second thing he noticed was the woman standing on it. Maeve Holloway was not what Carrizo Springs would have called a beauty. She was tall, nearly his height, and big-bodied in a way that the polite women in town described with lowered voices and careful pauses. She had dark red hair pulled back in a knot that was already coming loose, a square jaw dusted with freckles, and hands that looked like they'd done real work recently and expected to do more. She was wearing a plain brown dress with the sleeves rolled to her elbows and an apron that had flour on it. She looked at Colt the way you'd look at a horse someone was trying to sell you, appraising, skeptical, and not remotely impressed. "You're Mercer," she said. "I am. They told me you'd come today. I made biscuits. You want coffee?" "Sure." She turned and walked inside without waiting for him, and he followed because he didn't know what else to do. The house was small, 4 rooms, maybe 5, but it was ruthlessly organized. Every surface was clean. The shelves were labeled. There was a ledger open on the kitchen table with columns of numbers written in a hand so precise it looked printed. She poured him coffee in a tin cup and set a plate of biscuits between them. Then she sat across from him and folded her hands and looked at him with brown eyes that were steady and patient and completely unromantic. "I know why you're here," she said. They explained the arrangement. "And? And I'm not stupid enough to think this is about affection. You need money. I need legal standing. Gull and Pemberton want us combined because it's easier to control 1 unit than 2. She picked up a biscuit, broke it in half, and ate 1 piece with the efficiency of someone who didn't have time for pleasantries. "The question is whether you're honest enough to admit that." Colt stared at her. In his experience, women in Dimmitt County did not talk like this. They talked about weather and church socials and who was courting whom. They did not sit across from strange men and dissect power arrangements with the calm precision of a cattle auctioneer. "I'm honest enough," he said. "Good. Then here are my terms. I bring my cattle, my mineral rights, and my capital into the marriage. In exchange, I manage the books. All of them. I see every receipt, every contract, every note. Nothing financial happens on that ranch without my knowledge. You want to run the money. I want to know where the money goes. There's a difference. Most men wouldn't agree to that. Most men aren't $1,600 in debt with dry wells and dying cattle." She said it without malice, which somehow made it worse. She wasn't trying to wound him. She was just stating facts the way you'd state the temperature. It is hot. It is dry. You are broke. "What makes you think you can manage a ranch's finances?" he asked, and even as the words left his mouth, he could hear how they sounded, condescending, dismissive, the exact tone that every man in this county used when a woman said something that made him uncomfortable. Maeve reached across the table and turned the open ledger toward him. My father's books for the last 3 years. I kept them. Every entry, every reconciliation. When he was alive, we never missed a payment, never shorted a hand, never carried more debt than we could service. She tapped the page. After he died, I liquidated the excess stock at market peak, paid off the property tax 2 years in advance, and banked the remainder at 4% in San Antonio instead of Braddock's Bank, because Braddock's Bank charges fees he doesn't disclose. Colt looked at the ledger. The numbers were meticulous. He could barely manage his own books. Half the time he just stuffed receipts in a coffee can and tried to sort them out at the end of the month. You moved your money out of Braddock's Bank, he said. First thing I did after the funeral. You know that? He does now. Something shifted in Colt's chest. Not attraction exactly, but a grudging recognition of competence. This woman had been managing money better than he ever had, and she'd been doing it while the whole county pretended she didn't exist. All right, he said. You handle the books. And one more thing. What? Don't pretend this is something it's not. Don't perform affection for the neighbors. Don't make promises you can't keep. We're business partners who happen to share a legal name. That's all this needs to be. That's fine with me. Good. She stood up and carried her coffee cup to the basin. The wedding can be Thursday. I don't need a dress, and I don't need flowers. I just need you to show up sober. They were married on Thursday afternoon by a circuit preacher in front of 6 witnesses, 4 of whom were there out of curiosity, and 2 of whom were there because they worked for Gull and wanted to make sure it actually happened. Maeve wore the same brown dress. Colt wore the cleanest shirt he owned, which had a small tear near the left cuff that he tried to hide by keeping his hand in his pocket. The ceremony took 8 minutes. Nobody cried. Nobody threw rice. The preacher looked vaguely uncomfortable, as though he sensed something transactional in the proceedings, but couldn't put his finger on what. When it was done, Colt shook hands with the witnesses and Maeve signed the marriage certificate with the same precise handwriting she used in her ledgers. They drove back to the Mercer Ranch in Colt's wagon, sitting 3 feet apart, saying nothing. The sun was going down over the Mesquite Flats, throwing long shadows across the cracked earth, and the silence between them was not hostile, but it was not comfortable either. It was the silence of 2 people who had made a bargain they weren't sure they could live with. When they pulled up to the ranch house, Wick was waiting on the porch with his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, nodding at Maeve. "Mr. Hoskins. Wick, please." Wick. She looked at the house, then at the barn, then at the corral where 24 skinny cattle stood in the late-day heat. "How many hands do you have?" "3, counting me," Wick said. 3 men for 600 head. "It was 5 last year. 2 quit when they heard the wells were going dry." Maeve nodded slowly, processing. Colt could practically see the numbers running behind her eyes. "I'd like to see the books tonight," she said to Colt. "All of them. They're in the office, such as it is. And the water situation. I want to see every well, every cistern, every creek bed on the property. Tomorrow morning, if that works." "It works." She picked up her bag, one bag, not large, and walked inside as if she'd lived there her whole life. Wick looked at Colt. "She always like that?" "I think so." "Huh." Wick put his hat back on. "Might not be the worst thing." The first week was education. Maeve went through the Mercer Ranch books with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining a wound, and what she found made her angry in a way she kept carefully contained, but that Colt could feel radiating off her like heat from a stove. "You're paying 30% above market rate for feed," she told him on the 3rd night, the kitchen table buried under papers. 30%, do you know that? Feed's expensive out here. Feed is expensive everywhere, but Braddock's cousin owns the feed operation in Carrizo Springs, and he's been charging you a premium because he knows you don't have another option. She pulled out a sheet of figures she'd written up. There's a cooperative in Del Rio that sells the same grade for 22 cents less per hundredweight. The transport adds 8 cents. You're still saving 14 cents across 600 head. Del Rio's 40 miles. Mathematics doesn't care about distance. You'd save over $200 a year. $200. That was a new well. That was 3 months of wages for a hired hand. That was the difference between making a note payment and not making one. "How do you know about the Del Rio Cooperative?" he asked. I wrote to them. Last month, before the wedding, I wrote to 4 feed operations across South Texas and requested price sheets. Del Rio was the best. She paused. I also wrote to a cattle broker in San Antonio who handles direct sales to packing houses. He'll give us $3 more per head than the syndicate buyers in Carrizo Springs, and he doesn't require consignment. Colt sat down heavily. He'd been selling to the syndicate buyers his entire life because that's what his father had done, and his father's father before that. It had never occurred to him that there were other channels, other markets, other ways to move beef that didn't run through the men who were systematically strangling him. "Why would you do all that?" he asked. "Before the wedding, before you even met me." Maeve looked at him with those steady brown eyes. "Because I knew what kind of operation I was walking into, and I wasn't going to walk in blind." Colt didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which was becoming a pattern. The second week, she went to see the wells. Wick drove her in this buckboard while Colt stayed behind to work the cattle. And when they came back that afternoon, Wick had an expression on his face that Colt had never seen before. It took him a minute to identify it. It was hope. "She found water," Wick said, pulling Colt aside by the barn. "What?" "Not a new well, something better. There's an old creek bed running through the southeast quarter, been dry for years since your daddy's time. She asked me about it, and I told her it used to flow spring through fall when I was young. She walked the whole thing, 1.5 miles on foot in this heat, and she found where it's been diverted." "Diverted?" "Someone built a dam upstream, small one, just rocks and brush and packed earth. But it's enough to redirect the flow onto Gull's property. His cattle have been drinking our water for years." Colt felt something go cold in his stomach. "Gull built a dam on my land?" "Technically, it's on county land, right at the property line. But the effect is the same. Your water's been going to his cattle." "And she found this, walking and looking and asking questions. She asked me where the old creek ran, and I showed her on your daddy's survey map. Then she followed it upstream until she found the dam." Wick scratched the back of his neck. "I've been working this ranch 30 years, and I never walked that creek bed. Never thought to." When Maeve came inside that evening, dusty and sunburned and moving with the heavy-footed exhaustion of someone who'd walked miles in the Texas heat, Colt was sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee poured. He pushed one toward her. "Wick told me about the dam." She sat down and wrapped her hands around the cup. Her face was red and peeling across the nose, and there was a scratch on her forearm from mesquite thorns. She looked nothing like the composed woman who'd served him biscuits on her father's porch. "It's been there at least 5 years based on the growth patterns," she said. "Maybe longer. Whoever built it knew what they were doing. It looks natural unless you're specifically looking for it." "You think Gull did it?" "I think Gull's cattle have had reliable water on his south range while yours have been dying of thirst on land that used to have a creek running through it. I'll let you draw your own conclusion." Colt rubbed his face with both hands. The scope of it was staggering. Not just the debt and the squeeze play and the arranged marriage, but this too. They'd been stealing his water for years. While he'd been blaming the drought, blaming bad luck, blaming his father's drinking for leaving him a broken operation, the men who controlled his note had been literally diverting the lifeblood of his ranch onto their own property. "We need to tear it down," he said. "Not yet." "What do you mean, not yet?" "If we tear it down now, they'll claim it was natural and rebuild it, or they'll say we damaged county property. We need to document it first, survey it, photograph it if we can, get a sworn statement from someone who remembers the creek when it flowed. Then we take it to the county surveyor and file a formal complaint." "The county surveyor is Pemberton's nephew." "I know. That's why we also send copies to the state land office in Austin and to the Texas Cattlemen's Association and to a lawyer I know in San Antonio who handles water rights disputes." Colt stared at her. "You know a water rights lawyer?" "My father knew one. I've maintained the correspondence." "Of course you have." He meant it to sound dismissive or at least neutral, but it came out with something uncomfortably close to admiration, and Maeve glanced at him with a flicker of surprise before looking away. The town found out about the marriage faster than either of them expected, and the reaction was exactly what Maeve had predicted: cruel, gleeful, and constant. Colt heard the first joke at the feed store on Saturday morning from a rancher named Dale Pickett, who had a spread west of town and a mouth that never stopped moving. Heard you got hitched, Mercer. To the Holloway girl. Pickett grinned like he'd been saving this up all week. Tell me something. When she walks through the house, do the floorboards hold? The two men with Pickett laughed. Colt felt his jaw tighten. Shut your mouth, Dale. Oh, come on. I'm just having fun. We all are. Half the county's been talking about it. Colt Mercer, good-looking kid, could have had any girl in Dimmitt County, and he ends up with... Pickett puffed his cheeks and spread his arms. More laughter. Colt stepped forward and Pickett stepped back, and for a moment the air between them was very thin and very hot. Then Colt turned and walked out of the store, leaving his feed order unfinished, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the effort of not putting one of them through Dale Pickett's face. He didn't tell Maeve about it. He didn't need to. She already knew. She'd known her whole life. She went into town herself the following Wednesday, driving the buckboard alone because she needed supplies, and because she refused to hide on the ranch like a prisoner. Colt learned later what happened from Mrs. Elena Ruiz, who ran the dry goods store and was one of the few people in Carrizo Springs who didn't seem to find cruelty entertaining. 3 women, Elena told Colt, shaking her head, standing right there on the boardwalk when your wife came out of my store, talking loud enough for her to hear, saying things about her size, about the marriage, about how she must have trapped you somehow because no man in his right mind would choose. Elena stopped and pressed her lips together. Your wife didn't say a word, just loaded her supplies and drove away. But I could see her hands on those reins, Colt. She was holding them so tight her knuckles were white. That night, Colt found Maeve in the kitchen going over the feed accounts as if nothing had happened. Her face was calm. Her handwriting was steady. But there was something in the set of her shoulders, a rigidity, a held-inness, that made Colt think of a fence post driven deep into hard ground, standing upright not because it wanted to, but because it had no other choice. I heard what happened in town, he said from the doorway. Nothing happened in town. Elena told me. Maeve's pen stopped moving for just a moment, then resumed. Elena should mind her own business. She was worried about you. She doesn't need to be. I've been hearing that kind of talk since I was 12 years old. It stopped hurting a long time ago. She was lying. Colt could tell she was lying because her voice had gone too flat, too controlled. The way a person sounds when they're holding something breakable and concentrating very hard on not dropping it. He wanted to say something kind, something that would matter, but he didn't know how. He was 22 years old and he'd never been good with words, and the distance between them was not the 3 feet of kitchen floor, but something wider and deeper that he didn't have the tools to cross. Your feed numbers are wrong, Maeve said, changing the subject with the decisiveness of someone closing a door. You've been double counting the oat supplements. The actual cost per head is lower than you think. Good, Colt said. That's good. It's not good. It means you've been overpaying yourself for feed management. The money's been leaking. Right. He stood there for another moment, feeling useless, then went to bed in the small back room he'd been sleeping in since she'd arrived. She slept in the main bedroom. They'd never discussed the arrangement. It had simply happened, the way things do between people who are sharing a life without sharing a reason to be together. 3 weeks in, the first real test came. Not from Gull or Pemberton or the town gossips, but from the land itself. A norther blew in on a Sunday night, a real one. Not the mild cold fronts that passed through in early fall, but a hard blue wall of wind that dropped the temperature 30 degrees in 3 hours and brought ice with it. Ice in West Texas in October was rare but not impossible, and when it came mean. Colton Wick and the 2 remaining hands, a young Mexican named Joaquin and a quiet older man everyone called Dutch, spent the night moving cattle into the low draws where the mesquite would break the wind. They lost 4 head anyway, 2 calves that froze where they stood, and 2 cows that panicked and ran into a barbed wire fence in the dark. When Colt came back to the house at dawn, frozen and exhausted and bleeding from a wire cut on his forearm, Maeve was waiting with hot coffee and a basin of warm water and strips of clean cloth for bandaging. 4 dead, he said, sitting down heavily. 2 calves, 2 cows. One of the cows was pregnant. I know, I counted when you were bringing them in. You were watching? I was counting. There's a difference. She took his arm without asking and cleaned the wire cut with a gentleness that surprised him. Her hands were warm. You need to close that south fence line. It's the third time cattle have run into it. I know, I can't afford new wire. You can afford to take down the existing wire and restring it tighter. That costs labor, not money. We don't have the labor. You have me. He looked at her. She was wrapping the bandage around his forearm with the same precision she used on her ledger columns, each pass firm and even. You want to string fence? I want the cattle to stop killing themselves on wire that should have been fixed months ago. If that means I string fence, then I string fence. It's hard work. I know what hard work is. She tied off the bandage and let go of his arm, and for a moment they were very close and very still, and Colt could smell the flour on her apron and the coffee on her breath, and something else, something like iron filings or determination, and he thought, this is the strangest marriage in the history of Texas. The next morning she was out at the south fence line with Joaquin, wearing leather gloves that were too big for her hands, and pulling wire with a grip that made the young ranch hands stare. She's strong, Joaquin told Colt later, with the simple honesty of a man who measured people by what they could do rather than what they looked like. Stronger than Dutch, maybe, and she doesn't complain. No, Colt said. She doesn't. Word of the fence work got around, the way everything got around in a county where gossip was the primary form of entertainment, and it added a new layer to the jokes. Now Maeve was not just the fat wife that Colt Mercer had been forced to marry. She was also the fat wife who did men's work, which in the rigid taxonomy of West Texas gender roles was somehow both admirable and hilarious at the same time. Colt heard the jokes and felt something shifting inside him, a slow, grinding rotation of perspective, like a weather vane turning in a changing wind. He was not falling in love with Maeve. He wasn't sure he knew what that meant, but he was beginning to understand that the woman he'd married was not the woman the town thought she was, and the distance between those two things was becoming harder to ignore. 6 weeks after the wedding, Gull came to visit. He arrived in a polished surrey with 2 riders flanking him, which was how Gull always traveled, never alone, always with an escort, as if he expected ambush or simply enjoyed the theater of it. He dismounted in the ranch yard and looked around with the assessing gaze of a man pricing property. "Colt," he said, extending a hand. Colt shook it. He didn't want to. "Harlan. Place looks better. You've been busy." "My wife's been busy." "Ah, the famous Mrs. Mercer." Gull smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made you want to check the horizon for smoke. "Is she here?" Maeve came out of the house wiping her hands on a cloth. She'd been going over cattle contracts at the kitchen table, and there were ink stains on her fingers. She looked at Gull the way she looked at everything, directly, without pretense, without the social lubrication that most people use to make interaction smoother. "Mr. Gull." "Mrs. Mercer, I've heard wonderful things." "I doubt that." Gull's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. He was not accustomed to being contradicted, especially by women, and especially by women who the entire county agreed were beneath notice. "I came to discuss the note," Gull said, turning back to Colt. "Specifically, the revised terms." "What revised terms?" "Well, given the change in your circumstances, the marriage, the combined assets, we feel it's appropriate to restructure. Longer timeline, lower payments, a gesture of good faith." "What's the catch?" Maeve said. Gull looked at her. "Pardon?" "Restructuring benefits us. You don't do things that benefit other people, so what's the catch?" The yard was very quiet. Joaquin had stopped mucking a stall. Wick was standing by the barn door with his arms crossed. Even the horses seemed to be listening. Gull reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "We'd need a first position lien on the mineral rights, Mrs. Mercer's mineral rights specifically, the ones she brought into the marriage." There it was, the teeth. Colt could feel them now, sharp and inward pointing, just like he'd known they would be. "You want my mineral rights as collateral," Maeve said, "as additional security for the restructured note. Those mineral rights are the only unencumbered asset I own. They're worth more than the note. Which is exactly why they make excellent collateral. You'd only lose them if you default, and given your—" Gull paused delicately. "Evident capabilities, I'm sure that won't happen." Maeve looked at the document without taking it. Then she looked at Colt. Then she looked at Gull with an expression that was so calm it was almost serene, and she said, "No." Mrs. Mercer. No. Those are my terms. The mineral rights stay unencumbered. If you want to restructure the note, do it on the existing collateral. If you don't, we'll make the original payments on the original schedule. You can't make those payments. The arithmetic doesn't work. The arithmetic works fine since we stopped overpaying for feed and started selling direct to San Antonio. We've reduced operating costs by 18% in 6 weeks. We'll make the first payment in December, on time. Gull stood very still for a long moment. The two riders behind him sat their horses in silence. The wind blew dust across the yard and pushed a tumbleweed against the corral fence. "You've been busy," Gull said again, and this time the words meant something different. He left without the signed document. As the Surrey rolled down the ranch road, Colt turned to Maeve with a feeling that was part relief and part terror. "Can we actually make that payment in December? If we sell 40 head to the San Antonio broker at $3 over syndicate price, and if we close the Del Rio feed contract this week, and if we don't lose any more cattle to that fence, yes, we can make it with about $12 to spare." $12? I said it would work. I didn't say it would be comfortable. Colt almost laughed. He caught himself, surprised by the impulse. He hadn't laughed in months. "They're going to come back," he said. "Gull doesn't lose." "Gull hasn't lost yet," Maeve corrected. "That's a different thing." She went back inside to her ledgers, and Colt stood in the yard watching the dust settle where Gull's Surrey had been. And he thought about the dam on the creek and the feed prices and the mineral rights and the careful, methodical way Maeve had dismantled 6 weeks of assumptions in a single conversation, and he felt the weather vane inside him turn another degree. He was not in love with his wife. He was not even sure he liked her. But he was beginning to understand that the marriage everyone expected to destroy him might be the only thing keeping him alive. That night, lying in the back room listening to the wind scrape against the walls, Colt heard something from the main bedroom. Not crying exactly, Maeve didn't cry, or if she did it so quietly that it was nearly invisible. But something, a catch in her breathing, a sound like someone pressing their face into a pillow to muffle something they didn't want anyone else to hear. He lay there in the dark and listened, and he felt the distance between them like a physical thing, a wall made of pride and pain, and the absolute certainty that neither of them knew how to need another person without it costing them something they couldn't afford. In the morning, she was at the kitchen table with coffee already made, her ledger open, her face composed, her handwriting perfect. She looked up when he came in. "The Del Rio contract came through," she said. "We start next month." "Good. Also, I've drafted a letter to the state land office about the dam. I'd like you to read it before I send it." "I'll read it after breakfast." "Fine." He poured coffee and sat across from her, and they ate biscuits in the shared silence of two people who were learning, slowly and painfully, and without any map, how to survive together in a place that wanted them both to fail. Outside, the sun came up over the brown hills of West Texas, and the wind carried dust and the distant sound of cattle, and somewhere upstream on a creek that hadn't flowed in years, a dam made of rocks and brush sat waiting for someone to tear it down. The letter to the state land office went out on a Monday, and by Friday the entire county knew about it. Colt never figured out exactly how the information leaked. Could have been the postmaster, who was Pemberton's drinking companion. Could have been one of the clerks at the land office in Austin who owed a favor to someone who owed a favor to Gull. It didn't matter. What mattered was that by the end of that week, Harlan Gull knew that Maeve Mercer had filed a formal water rights complaint documenting the dam on the Southeast Creek, and he responded the way powerful men always respond when someone small threatens to make them accountable. He sent lawyers. 2 of them arrived at the ranch on a Saturday morning in a hired buggy, wearing suits that had no business being within 50 miles of a cattle operation. They introduced themselves as representatives of the Carrizo Springs Land and Cattle Association, and presented Colt with a document that was 11 pages long and full of language so dense it might as well have been written in Greek. "What is this?" Colt asked, holding the papers like they were contaminated. "A cease and desist regarding your complaint to the state land office," the taller lawyer said. He had a thin mustache, and the kind of posture that suggested he'd been told to stand up straight so many times as a child that it had become a permanent condition. The association maintains that the structure in question is a natural formation and that your complaint constitutes a frivolous filing intended to harass. A natural formation, Colt repeated. That is the association's position. Maeve had come out onto the porch during this exchange. She was holding a coffee cup and wearing an expression that Colt was learning to recognize, the one that meant she was doing arithmetic behind her eyes, and the numbers were making her angry. "May I see that?" she said, reaching for the document. The lawyer hesitated, glancing at Colt as if asking permission to interact with the woman. "Give it to her," Colt said. Maeve read the entire 11 pages standing on the porch in the morning sun, while the two lawyers waited in their buggy and Colt leaned against the porch rail, trying to look more relaxed than he felt. She read slowly, carefully, turning each page with her ink-stained fingers and occasionally pausing to reread a paragraph. When she finished, she looked up. "This references Section 14 of the County Water Statute," she said, "but it quotes the 1871 version, which was superseded by the 1879 amendment. The 1879 amendment specifically addresses artificial diversion of natural waterways and assigns liability to the party that benefits from the diversion, not the party that reports it." The shorter lawyer blinked. The taller one opened his mouth and closed it again. "Furthermore," Maeve continued, "a cease and desist has no legal force unless issued by a court. This is a letter from a private association pretending to be a legal order. If you file this in any court in Texas, I will counterfile with the State Land Office's own survey guidelines, which require physical inspection of any disputed structure within 60 days of a complaint. Your clients don't want a physical inspection, because a physical inspection will confirm that the dam is made of cut lumber and packed earth, which is not a natural formation by any definition in any statute in any state." The silence that followed was so complete that Colt could hear a mockingbird singing somewhere behind the barn. "Where did you study law?" the taller lawyer asked, and there was something in his voice that was no longer condescending. It was cautious. "I didn't study law. I read." Maeve handed the document back to him. "Tell Mr. Gull that the complaint stands, and tell him that if he sends anyone else to this property with documents designed to intimidate rather than inform, I will add a harassment addendum to the filing." The lawyers left. Colt watched the buggy disappear down the ranch road and then turned to Maeve, who was already going back inside. "You memorized the county water statute?" "I memorized the parts that were relevant. After I found the dam, I wrote to the state land office and requested the full statutory framework. It arrived last week. 46 pages. I've read it 3 times. 3 times? The language is dense. I wanted to be sure I understood the precedents." Colt shook his head slowly. He was starting to feel like he was living with someone who operated on a completely different level than anyone he'd ever known. Not just smarter, though she was clearly that, but more prepared, more thorough, more relentlessly systematic in her approach to every problem. Where Colt reacted, Maeve anticipated. Where Colt guessed, Maeve calculated. And where Colt would have backed down from 2 lawyers in expensive suits, Maeve had taken them apart with the calm efficiency of someone disassembling a faulty machine. "They'll come at us harder now," he said. "I know. Are you ready for that?" She looked at him over her shoulder, and for just a moment the composed mask slipped and he saw something underneath. Not fear exactly, but a fierce, burning stubbornness that was almost frightening in its intensity. "I've been ready for that my whole life," she said. "Nobody's ever given me the chance before." The retaliation started small and escalated fast. First, the Del Rio feed contract fell through. The cooperative sent a polite letter explaining that they could no longer service accounts in Dimmitt County due to logistical constraints, which was a phrase that meant someone had leaned on them. Then the San Antonio cattle brokers stopped returning Maeve's letters. Then 2 of the ranch's remaining customers for direct beef sales suddenly canceled their orders on the same day with the same excuse: they'd found another supplier. "They're boxing us in," Maeve said, spreading the letters across the kitchen table like evidence at a trial. "Cutting off every alternative channel I opened." "Gull?" "Gull, Braddock, Pemberton. Does it matter which one? They all answer to the same interests. The syndicate controls the supply chain in this region: feed, transport, sales, credit. If they decide you don't do business, you don't do business." Colt sat across from her, feeling the familiar weight of helplessness settle over him like a wet blanket. This was the part he hated most. Not the physical hardship, not the long hours, but the suffocating certainty that the game was rigged and always had been. His father had felt it too. It was part of what had driven him to the bottle. So what do we do? Maeve was quiet for a long time. She picked up one of the cancellation letters and turned it over in her hands, studying it as if the paper itself might reveal something useful. We go around them, she said finally. Around them how? You just said they control everything. They control everything in this region, but Texas is a big state and the cattle market doesn't end at the Dimmitt County line. She stood up and went to the shelf where she kept her correspondence files, a wooden box organized with labeled dividers that made Colt's coffee can system look prehistoric. She pulled out a folder and spread its contents on the table. I've been writing to buyers in Houston, packing houses, hotel suppliers, military contracts. The Army needs beef at Fort Clark and Fort Davis, and they don't buy through the syndicate. They buy through independent brokers who bid on government contracts. Houston's 300 miles, and San Antonio is 150, and they already shut us out of San Antonio. The question isn't how far, it's whether the margin covers the cost. I've been running the numbers. She pulled out a sheet covered in her precise handwriting. If we can get a military supply contract at the Fort Clark rate, which is 40 cents per pound dressed weight, and if we drive the cattle ourselves instead of paying for rail transport, we clear a profit of $11 per head over the syndicate price. Drive cattle to Fort Clark? That's 120 miles through open range. 114, I measured it on the survey map. Colt stared at the numbers. $11 per head. On 200 cattle, that was $2,200. Enough to pay the note, fund operations for 3 months, and still have money left. It was an enormous sum. It was also an enormous gamble. Who's going to buy from us? We're nobody. We don't have a reputation. We don't have connections. We have quality cattle. That's what matters to the Army. They don't care about county politics. They care about weight and health and delivery schedule. Maeve tapped the folder. I've already written a proposal. I need you to sign it because the Army won't contract with a woman. There it was again, that flat, factual delivery of an injustice so fundamental that it should have made someone angry, but Maeve stated it the way she stated everything else. Like weather, like arithmetic. I'll sign it, Colt said. The proposal went out, and while they waited, Maeve turned her attention to the ranch itself. She'd been studying the land with the same methodical intensity she applied to everything else, walking the property lines with Wick, examining soil quality, testing water sources, mapping grazing patterns. And what she found changed everything. You're overgrazing the north pasture and underusing the south, she told Colt one evening, spreading a hand-drawn map across the kitchen table. The north has been your primary range for how long? Since my father's time. 20 years, maybe longer. It shows. The grass is thin, the soil is compacted, and the root systems are degraded. That's why your cattle are skinny. They're eating, but the forage has no nutrition left. So we move them south? We rotate them. North pasture rests for 60 days while the south carries the herd. Then we swap. The resting pasture recovers, the forage regenerates, and the cattle gain weight on fresh grass. It's not complicated, but it requires fencing the south pasture properly, which means wire, which we can't afford. We can if we tear down the fence on the east line. You don't need it. There's a natural barrier. The creek bed runs along the eastern boundary, and even dry it's deep enough that cattle won't cross it. Salvage that wire, restring it on the south pasture, and we have a rotation system for free. Colt looked at the map she'd drawn. It was detailed and accurate, with distances marked in grazing areas shaded in different tones of pencil. She'd even calculated forage density per acre based on soil samples she'd taken herself. How do you know about pasture rotation? He asked. I read a paper published by the Agricultural College in College Station. They've been studying grazing management on experimental ranches. The results are significant, 20 to 30% weight gain per head over 2 seasons. She paused. I wrote to the author. He sent me additional data. You wrote to a professor. He's a researcher, not a professor. And he was very helpful. He also mentioned that drought-stressed grasses recover faster when the topsoil is broken up before the rainy season. We can do that with a simple drag, a frame of mesquite logs pulled behind a horse. Joaquin can build one in a day. They started the rotation the following week. Wick was skeptical at first. 30 years of doing things one way creates a deep groove. But when he saw the south pasture grass after 2 weeks without cattle on it, already taller and greener than anything on the north range, he stopped arguing and started helping. Joaquin built the drag, and Maeve drove it herself across the resting pasture, bouncing behind a draft horse for hours in the heat, breaking up soil so hard-packed it rang like stone under the mesquite logs. She came back to the house each evening covered in dust and sweat, her arms aching, her back stiff, and sat down at the kitchen table to work the books until midnight. Colt watched her and felt something he couldn't name. Not pity, because Maeve would have hated pity, and not admiration exactly, because that word felt too clean for what he was experiencing. It was more like recognition. He was recognizing, slowly and uncomfortably, that this woman was working harder than anyone on the ranch, including him, and doing it while carrying a weight that none of them had to carry. Not the physical weight that the town mocked, but the weight of being dismissed, of having every idea questioned not because it was flawed, but because of who was offering it, of knowing that no matter how many problems she solved or how many dollars she saved, there would always be someone ready to reduce her to a joke about her body. The Army contract came through in late November, delivered by a military courier who handed the envelope to Colt and tipped his hat to Maeve. 200 head, Maeve read, sitting on the porch steps because her legs were tired from a day of fence work. Delivered to Fort Clark by March 1st. 42 cents per pound dressed weight, 2 cents above the standard rate. Why above standard? Because I included a quality guarantee in the proposal. Our cattle are inspected and certified healthy before departure. The Army pays a premium for reliability. You guaranteed our cattle are healthy? They are healthy. The rotation is working. Wick weighed the sample group yesterday. Average gain of 18 pounds per head since we started. That's ahead of the college station projections. She folded the contract and looked at it with an expression that was half satisfaction and half exhaustion. This covers the note payment, operating costs through spring, and enough left over to hire 2 more hands for the drive. Colt sat down next to her on the steps. The late afternoon sun was turning the hills gold, and for the first time in months, the ranch didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a place where something might actually grow. You did this, he said. We did this. Don't do that. Don't spread it around. I know who did the work. She glanced at him, surprised again by the honesty, and for a moment the mask dropped and he saw the real Maeve underneath, tired and proud and scared and stubborn and deeply, ferociously determined not to be beaten by people who had decided she was nothing before they ever learned her name. We still have to get the cattle there, she said quietly. 114 miles. Winter drive. It won't be easy. No, it won't. They sat in silence for a while, watching the light change, and something between them shifted again, not dramatically, not with any grand gesture or spoken declaration, but quietly, the way ice melts in spring. You don't see it happening, you just notice one day that the creek is flowing. The news of the Army contract hit Carrizo Springs like a slap. Nobody had expected it. The syndicate had assumed that cutting off Maeve's alternative channels would force the Mercers back into the fold, desperate, compliant, willing to sign over the mineral rights just to survive. Instead, she jumped over the entire regional market and landed a direct government contract that paid better than anything the syndicate offered. Gull heard about it on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, things started going wrong. The first incident was the salt. Someone had dumped rock salt across 3 acres of the south pasture, the resting pasture, the one Maeve had been carefully rehabilitating. Salt killed grass at the root. It would take years for those acres to recover, if they ever did. Colt found it at dawn, the white crystals glinting in the early light like frost that wouldn't melt. He stood at the edge of the damaged area and felt something crack inside him, not despair, but rage. A hot, clean, clarifying rage that burned away the helplessness and left something harder underneath. Somebody did this on purpose, he told Wick, who was kneeling in the salt-poisoned dirt, pinching the crystals between his fingers. Looks that way. Came in from the east, probably on horseback. The creek bed's dry enough to ride through without leaving tracks. Gull. Can't prove it. Don't need to prove it, I know. Maeve inspected the damage that afternoon. She walked the salted acres slowly, stopping to test the soil in several places. And when she came back, her face was the same composed mask it always was, but her hands were shaking. 3 acres, she said. It'll take out about 8% of our rotation capacity. We can compensate by extending the grazing cycle on the north pasture, but it means the cattle will be thinner at delivery. Thinner means less money. Yes. And they know that. Of course they know that. That's why they did it. The second incident came a week later. 12 head of cattle vanished from the north pasture overnight. Not wandered off, not lost to predators, but simply gone, as if they'd been driven through a cut fence and disappeared into the dark. Joaquin found the fence cut at the northeast corner, the wires snipped clean with a tool, the tracks of at least 3 riders heading north toward Gull's property line. Rustling, Colt said, and the word felt ancient and heavy in his mouth. They're rustling our cattle. He wanted to ride north. He wanted to ride right onto Gull's range and find his cattle and take them back and maybe break something while he was at it. But Maeve stopped him, literally standing in front of his horse in the yard with her hands on the bridle. You ride onto Gull's land angry and alone, you'll either get shot or get arrested. Either way, they win. They stole 12 head. That's $500. That's money we need for the drive. I know what it costs. I also know what it costs if you end up dead or in jail. We have a contract. We have a business. We can absorb the loss. We cannot absorb losing you. It was the most personal thing she'd ever said to him, and she seemed to realize it at the same moment he did. She let go of the bridle and stepped back, and the distance reasserted itself between them like a door swinging shut. File a report with the sheriff, she said, her voice businesslike again. Document the fence cut, document the tracks. We're building a record. When the time comes, the record will matter. The sheriff works for Gull. The sheriff works for whoever pays him. Right now, that's Gull. It won't always be. Colt filed the report. The sheriff, a man named Dodd Henley, who had the moral backbone of a garden hose, wrote everything down and promised to investigate and did nothing, which was exactly what Maeve had predicted. It's in the record, she said. That's what matters. The third incident was the worst. 2 weeks before they were supposed to begin the drive to Fort Clark, someone poisoned the water tank behind the barn. Not enough to kill the cattle outright, just enough to make them sick. 15 head came down with gut rot, staggering and bloated and refusing to eat. Dutch found them in the morning and called for Colt, and Colt called for Maeve, and together they stood in the corral looking at 15 animals that might live or might die, and either way wouldn't be fit for delivery. Arsenic, Maeve said, after testing the water with a kit she'd ordered from a pharmacy supply house in San Antonio. Low concentration, enough to sicken, not enough to leave evidence in the meat. Who would know how to dose arsenic that precisely? Someone who's done it before. Colt looked at the sick cattle and felt the rage come back, hotter than before. And behind the rage, something else. A cold, settling recognition that this was not going to stop. Gull and Braddock and Pemberton and whoever else was pulling strings behind them, they were not going to let the Mercers succeed. Every step forward would be met with a push back. Every victory would trigger a new attack. The game wasn't just rigged, it was designed to be unwinnable. He looked at Maeve and saw that she knew it too. She was standing with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and her eyes fixed on the sick cattle with an expression that was equal parts fury and calculation. We're down to 173 head fit for the drive, she said. The contract calls for 200. If we deliver short, they'll penalize us. If we deliver sick, they'll void the contract entirely. Can we find more cattle? Not without buying, and we don't have the capital. So we're done. No. She said it with a force that surprised them both. We are not done. We deliver 173 head in perfect condition, every animal inspected, every pound accounted for. We deliver early. We deliver above weight. And we write to the contract officer explaining the shortage and offering a discount on the remaining 27 head to be delivered within 60 days. You think the Army will accept a partial delivery? I think the Army cares about reliability and honesty. Every other supplier they deal with overpromises and underdelivers. We're going to underpromise and overdeliver. That's how you build a reputation. That's how you become the supplier they come back to. It was not a perfect plan. It was not a clean solution. It was a scramble, a compromise, a way of losing less badly instead of winning cleanly. But it was the best they had, and Colt looked at this woman the whole county laughed at, this woman who had been humiliated and dismissed and attacked and poisoned and sabotaged, and he saw someone who simply refused to quit, not out of optimism, not out of faith, out of something harder and more durable than either of those things, out of sheer grinding, bullheaded refusal to give the bastards the satisfaction. "All right," he said, "we drive in 2 weeks, 173 head, every one of them fat and healthy." "Every one of them," Maeve agreed. That night, after the sick cattle had been separated and dosed with charcoal and moved to clean water, after the poison tank had been drained and scrubbed, after Wick and Joaquin and Dutch had been told the plan and had agreed to it with the grim determination of men who had nothing left to lose, Colt found Maeve sitting on the porch in the dark. She was staring at the sky, and her face was wet. He sat down beside her without speaking. The stars were bright. They were always bright out here, away from town, where the darkness was so complete you could see the Milky Way spilling across the sky like something had broken open up there and was leaking light. "I keep thinking I should be used to it by now," she said, not looking at him. "The cruelty. I keep thinking I've been through enough of it that it shouldn't hurt anymore. But the cattle, watching them suffer like that. They didn't do anything. They just drank the water." "I know. Sometimes I wonder if it would be easier if I just gave Gull what he wants. The mineral rights, the land, all of it. Just let him win and walk away and go somewhere nobody knows my name." "Where would you go?" She wiped her face with the back of her hand and almost smiled. "I have no idea. That's the problem. There's nowhere to go. This is it. This is all I have." Colt sat with that for a while. The wind was cool, carrying the smell of sage and distant rain, and the sick cattle lowed softly in the quarantine pen. "It's all I have too," he said. She looked at him then, really looked at him, not with the appraising, skeptical gaze she'd used on his porch that first day, but with something rawer and less defended. And he looked back, and for a moment the distance between them narrowed to almost nothing, and they were just two people sitting in the dark on a porch in West Texas, both of them tired and scared and stubborn and holding on to something that everyone else had decided wasn't worth saving. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks. She stood up and went inside, and Colt stayed on the porch and listened to the cattle and the wind and the vast, indifferent silence of the plains. And he thought about arsenic and water and salt and stolen cattle. And he thought about a woman who could dismantle lawyers with statute citations and reorganize a failing ranch with nothing but a pencil and a stack of letters. And he thought that if they survived this drive, if they actually pulled it off, then maybe, just maybe, they were building something that nobody could take away from them. Not the land, not the cattle, not the contracts, or the mineral rights, or any of the things that could be measured in dollars and acres. Something else. Something harder to name and harder to destroy. He just wasn't sure what to call it yet. They left before dawn on a morning so cold that the horse's breath hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody had lit. 173 head of cattle, 4 riders, 1 wagon, and a woman who had never driven cattle farther than the distance between 2 pastures, heading south and west across 114 miles of open range toward a military fort that was expecting 200 head and would receive fewer. Maeve rode in the wagon because she couldn't ride a horse well enough for trail work, and she made no apologies about it. She sat on the bench seat next to Dutch, who drove, and she had the contract papers and a leather satchel at her feet and a rifle across her lap that she'd practiced shooting for exactly 3 afternoons behind the barn, hitting the target roughly half the time. "You ever fire that at something alive?" Dutch asked her as they rolled past the ranch gate in the gray pre-dawn light. "No. Hopefully you won't need to." "Hopefully." Colt rode point with Wick, the 2 of them pushing the herd south along the old Camino Trail that hadn't seen a proper cattle drive in years. Joaquin rode drag, eating dust and cursing in Spanish and swatting stragglers with a coiled rope. They made 7 miles the first day, which was slower than Colt wanted, but faster than Maeve had calculated, and they bedded down in a dry wash south of the Chaparral Flats, with the cattle bunched in a loose circle and a small fire that threw more shadow than light. 7 miles, Maeve said, writing in her journal by firelight. She had a small leather-bound book she'd brought specifically for the drive, and she recorded everything: miles covered, cattle count, water consumed, forage quality, weather conditions. At this rate, 16 days to Fort Clark. "We can do better," Colt said. "The terrain opens up past the Nueces. We'll make 10, maybe 12 miles a day on the flats. If the weather holds." If the weather holds. The weather did not hold. On the third day, a dust storm rolled in from the west. Not the gentle haze of a dry wind, but a real storm. A wall of brown that swallowed the horizon and turned the air into something you could chew. The cattle panicked. They'd been trail broken on the ranch, more or less, but no amount of training prepares an animal for the feeling of being sandblasted alive, and they scattered into the murk like marbles dropped on a tilted floor. Colt and Wick spent 4 hours chasing cattle through visibility, so poor that twice Colt lost sight of his own horse's ears. Joaquin got knocked off his mount by a steer that came out of the brown, nothing like a freight train with horns, and he hit the ground hard enough to crack 2 ribs. He got back on the horse because there was no other option, but Colt could hear him breathing through his teeth for the rest of the day, each inhale a small, controlled agony. When the storm passed, they counted 169. "4 head lost," Maeve said, her voice flat with the effort of not showing what that number meant to her. 4 head was $170. It was the margin between profit and loss on the contract. "They might have drifted," Wick said. "Could be out there somewhere." "We're not going back for them," Colt said. "We don't have the time." Nobody argued. They all knew the math. Every day on the trail was a day of forage consumed and weight lost. The cattle needed to arrive fat, and every hour of delay made that harder. Joaquin's ribs got worse on the 4th day. He rode hunched over, one arm pressed against his side, and by afternoon Maeve made Dutch stop the wagon so she could bind him up with strips of cloth wound tight around his torso. He sat on the wagon tailgate while she worked, his jaw clenched, staring at the ground. "You should ride in the wagon," Maeve told him. "I can ride." "Your ribs are cracked, possibly broken. Every time the horse jars you, you're risking a punctured lung." "I can ride." "Joaquin, with respect, Mrs. Mercer, you need 4 riders. 3 can't manage this herd on open range. You know that." She did know it. She finished the binding without another word, and Joaquin got back on his horse and rode drag for the rest of the day with the careful, rigid posture of a man holding himself together by willpower alone. That night around the fire, Colt sat next to Maeve while the others slept. "We're short on hands," he said quietly. "Joaquin's hurt worse than he's letting on. If we lose him, we lose the drive." "I know." "There's a settlement at Painted Rock, maybe 20 miles southwest. Small place, ranchers, a trading post, a few families. We could hire a rider there." "With what money?" "I've got $40 in my pocket. It's supposed to be for emergencies." "I'd say this qualifies." They reached Painted Rock on the 6th day, and it was less than a settlement. Just a cluster of adobe buildings around a spring-fed tank, with a trading post run by a man named Sutton, who looked like he'd been carved from the same sandstone as the landscape. Colt asked about hiring a rider, and Sutton pointed him toward a corral behind the post where a young woman was breaking a Mustang with more skill than most men Colt had ever seen. Her name was Lila Clearwater. She was maybe 19, and she rode like she'd been born in a saddle. She was lean and sundark and had a scar across her left cheek that she didn't explain and nobody asked about. She listened to Colt's offer, $20 for 12 days of work, Fort Clark and back, and said yes before he finished the sentence. "I've been stuck in this place for 3 months," she said, tightening the cinch on her saddle. "I'd ride for 10. "Don't tell my wife that. She'll negotiate you down." Lila looked at the wagon where Maeve was sitting with her journal, doing calculations, and then looked back at Colt with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and assessment. "Your wife runs the numbers?" "My wife runs everything. I just ride the horse." It was a joke, mostly, but the truth in it surprised him. Lila turned out to be worth every cent. She took over flank position and let Joaquin move to swing, which was easier on his ribs, and the herd immediately moved more smoothly. She had a way with cattle that was less about force and more about anticipation. She could read the herd's mood the way some people read weather, sensing a shift before it happened and positioning herself to redirect it. On the seventh night, Colt found her and Maeve sitting together by the wagon, talking. He hung back, close enough to hear, but not close enough to intrude. "How'd you learn to handle cattle like that?" Maeve was asking. "My uncle had a spread up near the Pecos. I worked it from the time I was 10. He died 2 years back, and I couldn't hold the land. Too young, too female, too everything." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. I'm not built for owning things. I'm built for moving." Lila paused. "How about you? How did a woman end up running a cattle drive?" "By accident and stubbornness." "Stubbornness is underrated." "It's the only thing I've ever had in reliable supply." Lila laughed, a short, bright sound that cracked the quiet night, and Maeve smiled, and Colt realized it was the first time he'd ever seen her smile without qualification or restraint. Not a polite smile, not a careful smile, but a real one, the kind that changes a person's whole face. He walked away before they noticed him, and he thought about that smile for a long time afterward. The Nueces crossing nearly ended everything. They reached the river on the 9th day, and it should have been low. The drought had been drying out every waterway in South Texas for 2 years. But a storm system had passed through upstream 3 days earlier, and the Nueces was running high and fast and brown, carrying debris and dead brush and the accumulated fury of a desert river that had been denied water for too long and was now taking revenge. "We can't cross that," Wick said, sitting his horse at the bank and watching the current tear a mesquite limb past them at the speed of a trotting horse. "Not with cattle." "There's a low-water crossing 2 miles upstream," Lila said. "I've used it before." "In flood?" "It'll be lower, not low, but lower." They rode upstream and found the crossing, and Lila was right. It was passable, barely. The water was hip-deep on a horse and moving fast, with a rocky bottom that would give the cattle some footing if they didn't panic. "If," Colt said, looking at the current. "We pushed them across in groups of 20, Maeve said from the wagon. She'd climbed down and was standing at the bank, studying the current with the same focused intensity she applied to ledger columns. Riders upstream and downstream of each group. The upstream rider breaks the current. The downstream rider catches any that get swept. "You read that somewhere?" Colt asked. "I read about river crossings on the Chisholm Trail. The principles haven't changed. The Chisholm Trail didn't have this kind of current." "Then we'll adapt." They started crossing at noon, and it took 4 hours. 4 hours of screaming at cattle that didn't want to enter the water, of dragging stubborn steers by ropes tied to saddle horns, of watching helplessly as the current grabbed animals and spun them downstream while riders scrambled to intercept. Colt's horse lost its footing twice in the rocky current, and the second time he went under, swallowing a mouthful of brown water that tasted like mud and copper and fear. Wick's horse went down completely in the deepest part of the crossing, dumping the old foreman into chest-deep water that tried to carry him away. Lila got a rope on him and hauled him to the far bank, where he lay on his back coughing up river water and swearing with a creativity that Colt would have admired under other circumstances. The wagon was last. Dutch drove it in with Maeve beside him, the leather satchel with the contract papers clutched to her chest like a child. The current hit the wagon broadside and pushed it downstream, the wheels grinding over rocks, the whole structure groaning and creaking. For one terrible moment, the right rear wheel lifted off the bottom and the wagon tilted, and Maeve grabbed the bench with one hand and the satchel with the other, and Colt saw her face. Not frightened exactly, but aware, intensely aware, of how close everything was to ending. Then the wheel came down, the wagon steadied, and Dutch whipped the team forward, and they lurched up the far bank, trailing water like a baptism nobody had asked for. They counted on the north bank. 162, 7 lost to the river. Maeve sat in the mud beside the wagon and counted again, her lips moving, her fingers ticking off numbers on her thigh. 162. She closed her journal and pressed her hands flat against the cover and sat very still for a long time. "We can still do this," she said finally, and Colt could hear what it cost her to say it, the effort of continuing to believe when the math kept getting worse. 162 head at 42 cents per pound, average dressed weight of 400 pounds. That's roughly $27,000 gross, minus the drive costs, the note payment, and the penalty for underdelivery. "Maeve," she looked up. "Stop counting for a minute." She stared at him, and then she did something he didn't expect. She nodded. She put the journal away. She sat in the mud and looked at the river that had just tried to destroy them, and she didn't count anything. I'm tired, Colt. I know. Not just from the crossing. From all of it. The salt, the poison, the stolen cattle, the lawyers, the jokes. I'm tired of fighting people who have more money and more power and more friends and who will never, ever stop coming after us because we had the nerve to not disappear. He sat down next to her in the mud. His clothes were soaked. His horse was standing 10 feet away with its head down, dripping. Somewhere behind them, Joaquin was coughing and Wick was wringing out his hat, and Lila was counting cattle with the calm efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago that panic was a luxury working people couldn't afford. You want to quit? Colt asked. Not accusing, not testing, a real question. No. She said it immediately, reflexively, the way you'd pull your hand off a hot stove. I just want to be tired for a minute. Is that allowed? It's allowed. They sat there for a while, two muddy people on a riverbank in the middle of nowhere, and the sun came through the clouds and hit the water and turned it gold. And neither of them said anything, because sometimes the most honest thing you can do is shut up and exist next to someone who's carrying the same weight you are. Then Maeve stood up, wiped her hands on her dress, and opened the journal again. We need to make 14 miles tomorrow to stay on schedule, she said. The terrain south of here is flat grassland. If we start at first light, we can do it. Then we start at first light. They made 12 miles the next day, and 13 the day after, and the terrain cooperated the way the river had not. Flat, open, dotted with good grass and scattered water holes that the cattle drank from gratefully. The herd settled into a rhythm, and the riders settled into a rhythm, and for 3 days the drive moved south with the steady, grinding efficiency of a machine that was broken in several places, but still running. On the 12th night, the raiders came. Colt heard them before he saw them. Hoofbeats on the hard ground coming fast from the north, and a sound that might have been a yell or might have been the wind, but turned out to be neither. He was out of his bedroll and on his feet before the first shot cracked across the camp, punching a hole in the night that seemed to let all the chaos in at once. "Riders!" Wick shouted, and then there were gunshots, and the cattle were moving, and the camp was a confusion of noise and dust and shadow. There were 6 of them. They came in hard and fast, not aiming at the people but at the herd, firing over the cattle to stampede them, to scatter them across the open range where they'd be easy to round up later. It was a professional job, practiced and efficient, and Colt knew immediately that these were not random rustlers. These were men who'd been sent. He got to his horse and got mounted and rode into the dark after the herd, which was already running south in a blind, terrified mass. Wick was somewhere behind him. Lila was somewhere ahead. Joaquin was trying to get on his horse with cracked ribs, and Dutch was under the wagon with Maeve's rifle, firing at shadows. The next 30 minutes were the longest of Colt's life. He rode in darkness, guided by sound, the thunder of hooves, the bawling of panicked cattle, the occasional crack of a gunshot that could have been friend or enemy. He couldn't see the riders. He couldn't see the herd. He could only ride and hope he was riding in the right direction and that the people behind him were doing the same. He caught up with the lead cattle near a dry wash about 2 miles south of camp. They'd slowed partly because the terrain was rough and partly because Lila was already there, turning them, her horse cutting back and forth in the moonlight with a precision that was almost supernatural. She wasn't shooting, she was just riding, placing herself between the cattle and the open range, forcing them to turn, to circle, to slow down. "How many riders?" she called when she saw Colt. 6. Maybe more. I counted 5. One of them went down. His horse stepped in a hole. He's walking back north. You sure? I heard the horse scream. Nobody rides away from that sound. Colt helped her hold the herd while Wick caught up, and then Joaquin riding one-handed with his other arm pressed against his broken ribs, and slowly they gathered the cattle back into something resembling a group. It took until dawn, and when the sun finally came up and they could see what they had, the count was 151. 11 more gone, scattered, stolen, lost in the dark. 11 animals that represented weeks of feeding and care and hope vanished in 30 minutes of engineered chaos. Maeve had walked the 2 miles from camp carrying the rifle and the leather satchel and a canteen of water. When she arrived, her dress was torn at the hem from mesquite thorns, and her face was scratched and she was breathing hard, but she was upright and her eyes were clear. 151, Colt told her. She took the number like a blow, a small flinch, a tightening around the mouth. And then she did what she always did. She opened the journal and adjusted the calculations. "We'll deliver short," she said, "significantly short. The penalty will eat most of our margin." "I know. But we'll deliver. That's what matters. We show up, we prove we can make the drive. We establish the relationship. The first contract is never where you make the money. It's where you make the reputation." Colt looked at her, muddy, scratched, exhausted, standing in a patch of West Texas scrubland at dawn with a journal full of numbers that kept getting worse. And he felt something shift inside him that was not the slow rotation of a weather vane, but something faster and more decisive, like a lock turning. "You're the toughest person I've ever met," he said. "And I mean that." She looked at him for a long time. Her eyes were red-rimmed from dust and sleeplessness, and there were mesquite scratches on her hands, and her hair had come completely out of its knot and hung around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger and more vulnerable than she ever allowed herself to be. "Don't say things you don't mean," she said. "I've never been good at saying things I don't mean. Ask anyone. It's one of my biggest problems." Something crossed her face, not a smile, but the shadow of one, the place where a smile would live if she let it. "2 more days," she said. "Let's finish this." They drove south with 151 head and 4.5 riders. Joaquin was riding, but barely, and the land flattened out into the broad, dry grassland of the Fort Clark Basin, and on the 14th day they saw the flag. It was flying above the fort's parade ground, visible for miles across the flat terrain, and when Colt saw it, he felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for so long he'd forgotten it was there. Not relief. Relief would come later, if it came at all. Just the physical sensation of arriving, of having covered 114 miles of dust and river and raiders and storm with enough cattle to matter. They drove the herd through the fort's south gate at 3 in the afternoon, and the quartermaster, a no-nonsense captain named Hargrove, met them at the stockyard with a clipboard and a look of professional skepticism. "Contract says 200, Hargrove said, counting. "We're delivering 151, Maeve said, climbing down from the wagon with the contract papers. "I've prepared a full accounting of the shortage, including the cause, organized raiding on the trail, and a proposed adjustment of 12% below contract price for the missing head, with a commitment to deliver the balance within 60 days at the original rate." Hargrove looked at the papers. Then he looked at Maeve. Then he looked at the cattle, which despite everything they'd been through were in good condition. The pasture rotation had done its work, and the animals that had survived the drive were solid and healthy. "These are good animals," he said, almost reluctantly. "Yes, they are. Most suppliers who deliver short try to hide it. Pad the count, substitute inferior stock, blame the weather. You're just telling me. We're telling you because we want a second contract. You can't build a business on lies." Hargrove studied her for a moment with the appraising look of a man who dealt with suppliers and contractors every day and had learned to sort the honest ones from the liars by instinct. "I'll accept the adjusted rate," he said. "Deliver the balance by March, and we'll talk about a standing agreement." Maeve nodded. She didn't celebrate. She didn't grin or shake his hand or show any outward sign that this man had just thrown them a lifeline. She simply nodded, as if the outcome had been inevitable all along, when in fact it had been balanced on a knife's edge every single day for 2 weeks. That night, camped outside the fort with the cattle penned and the contract signed and the first payment secured, Colt sat by the fire and watched Maeve sleep. She'd fallen asleep sitting up against the wagon wheel with the journal in her lap and a pencil still in her hand. And in sleep her face lost the composed mask and became something else, softer, unguarded, carrying the evidence of every mile and every fight and every sleepless night in the shadows under her eyes and the lines around her mouth. Wick sat down beside him and followed his gaze. "You know," Wick said quietly, "when you told me you were getting married, I thought it was the worst decision you'd ever made." "It might have been." "No." Wick shook his head slowly. "No, it wasn't. That woman right there. She's the reason any of us are still standing. You know it, and I know it, and pretty soon everybody in Dimmitt County is going to know it too. Colt didn't answer. He sat and watched the fire and listened to the cattle settle and thought about the long road back to a ranch that might or might not still be waiting for them. And he thought about the enemies who would be waiting regardless. And he thought about the woman asleep against the wagon wheel who had walked 2 miles through the dark carrying a rifle and a satchel of contract papers because she refused to let the numbers win. The fire burned down to coals. The stars came out. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called and another answered, and the sound traveled across the flat, empty land like a conversation between two creatures who understood that survival was not a destination, but a daily, ongoing act of stubborn, imperfect, unglamorous persistence. The ride back to Carrizo Springs took 9 days without cattle to slow them down, and every mile of it felt different from the drive south. Lighter, somehow. Not easier. Joaquin's ribs were still cracked, and Wick's cough from the river dunking hadn't cleared, and Colt's wire-cut arm had started aching in the cold. But lighter in the way that things feel when you've done something that people said you couldn't do, and you're still breathing on the other side of it. Lila rode with them as far as Painted Rock, where she collected her $20 and shook Colt's hand and then walked over to the wagon where Maeve was sitting. "You ever need another rider," Lila said, "you send word. I don't care where I am, I'll come. I might hold you to that." "I'm counting on it." Lila paused, then added, "You know, when Colt hired me, I thought this was just another outfit trying to stay alive. Seen 100 of them. Most of them fold, but you're different." "How?" "Most ranchers fight with what they've got. You fight with what you figure out. That's harder to beat." She rode south without looking back, the way people do when they've already decided they'll be coming back. They reached the Mercer Ranch on a Thursday afternoon and found it standing. That might sound like a small thing, but Colt had spent 9 days half expecting to come home to ashes. Gull had sent raiders to scatter their herd on the trail. It wasn't a stretch to think he'd send someone to burn the place while they were gone. But the ranch was there, and the reason it was there was standing on the porch in the form of Elena Ruiz's husband, Tomas, and 2 of his cousins, all 3 of them armed with shotguns and looking like men who had not slept well in recent days. "Elena sent us," sent us, Tomas said, shaking Colt's hand. "She heard things in town. People talking about your place being empty, being vulnerable. She didn't like the sound of it." "Anyone come?" 2 riders, about a week ago. Came in from the east after dark. Didn't announce themselves. My cousin Hector fired a round over their heads from the barn loft, and they turned around and left." Colt looked at Tomas, then at Hector, then at the 3rd cousin, a quiet man named Aurelio, who was already unsaddling his horse, as if this had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "I can't pay you," Colt said. "Not right now." "Elena didn't send us for money. She sent us because your wife was kind to her when nobody else in this town was. That's worth more than money." Colt glanced at Maeve, who had climbed down from the wagon and was listening from 10 feet away. Her face was doing something complicated, surprise and gratitude and something else, something raw and undefended, the look of a person who has been alone so long that kindness catches them off guard, like a slap. "Thank you," Maeve said. Just that. 2 words. But she said them in a voice that made Tomas look at the ground and nod, because some things don't require a lot of language. The contract payment arrived by military courier 2 weeks later, a bank draft drawn on the U.S. Treasury, payable to Colt and Maeve Mercer, in the amount of $23,412. It was the most money either of them had ever held in their hands, and Maeve looked at it for a long time at the kitchen table, running her finger along the printed numbers as if verifying that they were real. "First thing we do is pay the note," she said. "All of it. Not a payment, the whole balance." Colt stared at her. "The whole balance? That's $1,600. We could stretch that out over..." "Over what? Over months of Gull and Braddock holding it over our heads? Over months of them using the debt as leverage to come after the mineral rights again?" "No, we pay it off. We walk into Braddock's bank and we put $1,600 on his desk and we take our deed back free and clear. Then they have nothing. That leaves us with $21,000 for operations, expansion, the balance delivery to Fort Clark. That leaves us with $21,000 and no debt and no leverage points for anyone to exploit. That's not just money, that's freedom." She was right, and he knew it. The debt had been a chain around both their necks since before the wedding, and every scheme Gull had run. The mineral rights grab, the feed price manipulation, the dam, the rustling, the poison, had been designed to tighten that chain until they choked. Remove the chain, and the schemes lost their teeth. They drove to Carrizo Springs the next morning. Colt wore his cleanest shirt, a different one from the wedding, newer, without the torn cuff. Maeve wore a blue dress he'd never seen before, and when he looked at her sitting on the wagon bench in that blue dress with the bank draft in her satchel and the Texas sun turning her red hair copper, he thought she looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had won a fight that nobody thought she could win. Braddock's Bank was a limestone building on the main street of Carrizo Springs, with brass fixtures and a polished counter and the smell of money, that particular blend of paper and ink and quiet desperation that all banks share. Cyrus Braddock was in his office when they arrived, and his face when he saw them walk through the door was something Colt would remember for the rest of his life. Not shock exactly, more like the expression of a chess player who suddenly realizes that the piece he'd been ignoring has been moving across the board for the last 10 turns and is now 2 squares from checkmate. "Colt," Braddock said. "Mrs. Mercer." "Mr. Braddock." Maeve set the bank draft on his desk with the same precision she used for everything. "We're here to settle the note. Full payoff. I'd like a satisfaction letter and the original deed, please." Braddock looked at the draft. He picked it up. He looked at it again as if the numbers might change if he stared long enough. "This is a U.S. Treasury draft." "It is. From our cattle contract with Fort Clark. The amount exceeds the note balance. I'd like the difference deposited in a new account at the First National Bank in San Antonio, not here. I've already made arrangements." "You're moving your banking to San Antonio?" "We're diversifying our financial relationships. Nothing personal, Mr. Braddock, just business." It was personal. They all knew it was personal. Braddock had been charging them hidden fees for years, had conspired with Goal to squeeze them through the accelerated note, and had profited from every dollar of misery that had been inflicted on the Mercer Ranch. Maeve was not just paying off the debt. She was severing the relationship with the delicate surgical precision of a doctor removing a tumor. Braddock processed the payoff. He had no legal grounds to refuse. The satisfaction letter was prepared, the deed was returned, and Maeve placed both documents in her satchel with the care of someone handling something irreplaceable. On the way out, they passed Dale Pickett, who was coming in to make a deposit. Pickett looked at Colt, then at Maeve, and opened his mouth to say something, probably another joke, probably something about Maeve's weight, probably something that would have been funny to everyone in the room, except the 2 people it was aimed at. "Dale," Colt said, and something in his voice, something hard and settled and completely uninterested in pretending anymore, made Pickett close his mouth and step aside. They walked out into the sunlight, and Maeve exhaled, a long, slow breath that sounded like she'd been holding it for months. "That felt good," she said. "Yeah, it did." The second cattle drive to Fort Clark went smoother than the first, partly because Maeve had learned from every mistake and adjusted, and partly because Lila Clearwater showed up at the ranch 3 days before departure, as if she'd known by instinct that she was needed. "I said send word," Lila told Maeve. "You didn't send word." "I was going to." "You were going to do it yourself, is what you were going to do, with 3 riders and a prayer." Maeve almost smiled. "We don't use prayers around here." "Fine. 3 riders and stubbornness. That's more accurate." They delivered 53 head to Fort Clark, the balance from the first contract, and Captain Hargrove inspected every animal and found them above weight and in excellent condition. He signed the completion certificate and then, without ceremony, handed Maeve a second contract. 300 head, he said. Quarterly delivery. Standing agreement, renewable annually. Standard military rate plus the quality premium. Maeve read the contract in Hargrove's office, while Colt stood by the window, pretending to look at the parade ground and actually watching her face. She read every line, every clause, every number, and when she finished, she looked up at Hargrove. "The penalty clause for late delivery is excessive. 15% is standard for government contracts. This says 20. Hargrove looked at her the way people often looked at Maeve, with the specific surprise of encountering competence where they hadn't expected to find it. 15%, he agreed, and the weight specification needs a tolerance range. You're asking for 400 pounds dressed minimum, but cattle fluctuate. A 10-pound tolerance is reasonable. 8 pounds. Done. She signed the contract. Colt countersigned. And just like that, the Mercer Ranch had a standing military supply agreement worth over $100,000 annually. News traveled. It always did. Within weeks, every rancher in Dimmitt County knew that the Mercers had a Fort Clark contract, and the landscape began to shift in ways that were small at first, but accelerating. The first rancher to come asking for help was a man named Calvin Doss, who had a 100-head operation east of town and had been getting crushed by the syndicate's pricing the same way Colt had been crushed before Maeve opened the alternative channels. "I heard you're selling direct to the Army," Doss said, standing in the Mercer yard with his hat in his hands and the specific humility of a man who knows he's about to ask for something he doesn't deserve. "I was wondering if maybe we could talk about joining up, pooling our cattle for the drive. I'd pay my share of the cost." Colt looked at Maeve, who was standing on the porch with her arms crossed. "What's your herd count?" she asked. 82. Good stock. Herefords mostly. Health status? Clean. No blackleg, no screwworm. I vaccinated in October." "You vaccinated?" There was something in Maeve's voice, approval maybe, or recognition. Most small ranchers in the county couldn't afford vaccination. Doss had found a way. "My wife's brother is a veterinarian in Uvalde. He gives us the supply at cost." "I'd like to meet your wife's brother," Maeve said. "And yes, we can talk about pooling. I'll draw up terms tonight." Doss was the first. He was not the last. Over the next 3 months, 4 more ranchers approached the Mercers about joining their supply network. Small operators, all of them, men and women who had been systematically squeezed by the same syndicate that had tried to destroy Colt and Maeve. They came to the ranch with their hats in their hands and their pride swallowed, and Maeve sat with each of them at the kitchen table and went through their numbers and their herds and their health records, and she built a network. She called it the South Texas Independent Cattlemen's Cooperative, which was a name that sounded official but was really just Maeve with a ledger and a filing system and an iron will. The cooperative pooled cattle for the Fort Clark drives, shared feed costs through bulk purchasing from Del Rio, and split transport expenses across all members. The economies of scale brought costs down for everyone, and the collective herd size gave them negotiating power that no individual small rancher could have achieved alone. Gull watched all of this happen, and his response was predictable: escalation. The assault came on a night in late April, not against the Mercer Ranch, but against the cooperative. 3 members had their fence lines cut on the same night. 2 had cattle driven off. One, a widow named Sarah Breck, who ran 40 head on a postage stamp of land south of town, found a dead coyote hung from her gate with a note pinned to it that said, "Quit." Colt found out about it the next morning and rode straight to Sarah Breck's place, where he found Maeve already there, sitting with Sarah at her kitchen table, going through the damage assessment. 3 ranches hit in one night, Maeve said when Colt walked in. Coordinated. Same pattern as the raids on our drive. Gull. Who else? Sarah Breck was 60 years old, wire-thin, with the weathered face of a woman who'd spent 4 decades fighting the same land that was trying to kill her. She wasn't crying. She didn't look scared. She looked angry. "I've been ranching this land since before Harlan Gull knew which end of a cow eats," Sarah said. "I'm not quitting because some hired man hung a dead coyote on my gate." "Nobody's quitting," Maeve said, "but we need to change how we operate. Individual ranches are vulnerable. Together, we're harder to hit." What she proposed was audacious: a shared patrol system where cooperative members took turns riding each other's fence lines on a rotating schedule. No single ranch would be unprotected on any given night. The cost was labor, not money, and the cooperative had labor. "We're ranchers, not an army," Doss said when Maeve presented the plan at a meeting in the Mercer kitchen. 6 cooperative members crammed around a table meant for 4. "We don't need to be an army. We need to be organized. Gull is counting on us being scattered. Scattered is easy to pick apart. Organized is not. And if they come with guns? We file reports, every incident, every threat, every piece of evidence. I'm sending everything to the State Attorney General's office in Austin. Gull controls the county sheriff. He doesn't control the state." The patrol system went into effect the following week. The raids slowed. They didn't stop entirely. 2 more fence cuts, another attempted cattle theft that was turned back by Joaquin and Tomas Ruiz riding patrol together, but the frequency dropped. The cooperative was harder to hit, just as Maeve had predicted. And then the dam came down. Not literally, not yet. But the state land office, after months of bureaucratic processing, sent an inspector to examine the structure on the Southeast Creek. The inspector was a methodical man named Aldridge, who had no connection to Dimmitt County politics and no reason to lie. He spent 2 days surveying the dam, testing the construction materials, photographing the site, and interviewing Wick about the creek's historical flow. His report, filed with the state land office and copied to the county surveyor's office, was unambiguous. The structure was man-made, constructed within the last 10 years, and positioned to divert natural water flow from the Mercer property onto the adjacent Gull holding. It recommended immediate removal and restoration of the original creek bed. Gull's lawyers filed an objection. The state overruled it. The dam came down on a Tuesday morning in May, torn apart by Colt and Wick and Joaquin, while Maeve watched from the bank with her journal, documenting everything. The water came back slowly, the way water does in dry country. A trickle at first, dark with mud and debris, finding the old channel like a memory finding its way back to a place it used to know. Then more. Then a steady flow, not deep but constant, running through the southeast quarter for the first time in years. Colt stood at the bank and watched the water and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not triumph. Triumph was too clean a word for what he felt. More like justice, imperfect and delayed and covered in mud, but real. "How long do you think they were stealing our water?" he asked Maeve. Based on the vegetation patterns and the construction age, Aldridge estimated 7 to 10 years. 7 to 10 years. My father was alive for most of that. Yes. Colt thought about his father, the drinking, the despair, the slow erosion of a man who couldn't understand why his ranch was dying no matter what he did. The wells going dry, the cattle thinning, the debt accumulating. His father had blamed himself, blamed the land, blamed bad luck. He'd never known that the real cause was a wall of rocks and packed earth a mile upstream, quietly redirecting his lifeblood onto another man's property. He might not have died if he'd known, Colt said. He might not have... He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't need to, and because finishing it would have cost something he wasn't ready to pay. Maeve didn't say anything. She just stood next to him at the creek bank and watched the water flow. And after a while, she put her hand on his arm, briefly, lightly, the way you'd touch something fragile to let it know you're there. The cooperative grew. By midsummer, 11 ranches had joined, representing over 1,000 head of cattle, and a collective operation that rivaled anything the syndicate controlled. Maeve negotiated a second military contract, Fort Davis this time, and opened a direct sales channel to a packing house in Houston that paid premium prices for certified healthy beef. The syndicate's grip on the regional market loosened. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, the way Maeve did everything, methodically, inch by inch, with the patience of someone who understood that real power isn't seized in a single dramatic moment, but built through 1,000 small decisions, each one slightly better than the one before. Gull's influence began to erode. Ranchers who had depended on his buyers now had alternatives. Merchants who had feared his displeasure now had other customers. The political machinery that he and Pemberton and Braddock had operated for decades, the closed loop of debt and dependency and controlled markets, developed cracks, and through those cracks, something new was growing. Not an empire, not yet, but the foundation of one. Colt came home one evening in late August to find Maeve at the kitchen table with her journal and her correspondence files and a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The table was covered in papers, contracts, survey maps, grazing schedules, cooperative accounts. She was asleep in her chair, her head resting on her folded arms, her pen still in her hand. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and he thought about the first time he'd seen her on that porch in Eagle Pass, composed, skeptical, unimpressed. He thought about the biscuits and the ledger and the terms she'd laid out with the precision of a contract negotiator. He thought about the fence work and the dust storm and the river crossing and the raiders in the dark. He thought about the night she'd sat on the porch and cried and told him she was tired, and the morning after when she'd been at the table with coffee made and her handwriting perfect and her face giving nothing away. He pulled a blanket from the back of the couch and draped it over her shoulders. She stirred, but didn't wake. He sat down across from her and picked up the cold coffee and drank it because it was there and because he didn't want to make noise in the kitchen. The papers on the table told the story of what she'd built. Not just a ranch, a network. Not just a business, a community. Not just survival. The beginning of something that might last. He sat there for a long time, watching her sleep, drinking cold coffee, and listening to the sound of water running in the southeast creek, flowing steady and strong through land that had been dry for a decade, finding its way back to where it belonged. The first real rain came in September, 3 days after Colt moved his things from the back room into the main bedroom without either of them discussing it. There was no grand moment, no declaration, no scene that a novelist would have written with swelling music and meaningful glances. Maeve had fallen asleep at the kitchen table again, and Colt had carried her to the bed because the chair was bad for her back, and because he was tired of pretending that the distance between them was still something either of them wanted. She woke up when he set her down, looked at him with those brown eyes that missed nothing, and said, "You don't have to sleep in the back room anymore." "I know," he said. "I mean it." "I know you mean it." And that was all. No poetry, no promises. Just two people who had walked 114 miles of dust and river together and come out the other side and didn't need to explain to each other what that meant. The rain fell hard that night, a real soaking rain, the kind that West Texas gets maybe 3 times a year, when the sky opens up and dumps everything it's been hoarding for months. Colt lay in the dark, listening to it hammer the roof and run off the eaves and sheets, and he felt the land drinking, felt it in his bones the way ranchers do. That cellular awareness of water hitting dry earth and being pulled down into root systems and aquifers and the deep geology that keeps everything alive. Maeve was awake beside him. He could tell by her breathing. "The south pasture will be green in 2 weeks," she said quietly. "I was thinking the same thing. We should increase the rotation cycle to 90 days. Give the grass more recovery time. The College Station data supports it." "Maeve." "What?" "It's raining. Can we just listen to it rain?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed, a soft sound he was hearing more often now, and she said, "I don't know how to do that. Just listen. My brain doesn't stop. I've noticed." "Is that a complaint?" "It's an observation from a man who married the only woman in Texas whose brain runs 24 hours a day. 17. I sleep for 7, approximately. You sleep for 4. I've seen your lamp." Another silence, and then her hand found his in the dark, and they lay there listening to the rain together, and Colt thought that this was maybe the most honest thing he'd ever done, just holding a woman's hand and not saying anything and not needing to. The cooperative's second year was when the empire stopped being a metaphor and started being a fact. Maeve's network had grown to 14 ranches by spring, and the Fort Clark and Fort Davis contracts were delivering steady revenue that she distributed through the cooperative on a per-head basis, with a percentage held back for shared operating costs. She'd also opened a direct sales channel to 2 packing houses in Houston and a hotel supply company in San Antonio that paid premium prices for consistent quality. The numbers were staggering, at least by Dimmitt County standards. The cooperative moved over 3,000 head in its second year, generating gross revenue that eclipsed anything the syndicate had managed in the region. And because Maeve controlled the logistics, the drive schedules, the veterinary inspections, the contract negotiations, every dollar flowed through the Mercer Ranch, which made the Mercers not just successful ranchers, but the hub of an entire regional economy. Gull felt it. Everyone felt it. Everyone. The balance of power in Dimmitt County was shifting, and it was shifting toward a kitchen table in a 4-room ranch house where a woman with red hair and ink-stained fingers made decisions that affected 1,000 miles of cattle range. The final confrontation with Gull didn't come with gunfire or lawyers or midnight raids. It came with a letter delivered to the Mercer Ranch by regular post on a warm morning in March, written in Gull's own hand. Colt read it first, standing in the yard, and then handed it to Maeve without comment. She read it at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside her. The letter was 3 pages long, and it proposed a merger. Gull wanted to fold his operation into the cooperative, his cattle, his land, his buyers, all of it, in exchange for a partnership position and a 30% share of cooperative revenues. He wants in, Colt said. He wants control. 30% of revenues gives him veto power over any major decision. It's a buyout disguised as a partnership. So we say no. We say no. But the fact that he's asking tells us something important. What? He can't beat us. He's tried everything: debt manipulation, sabotage, rustling, poisoning, legal threats, raids. None of it worked. His only option left is to join, and he knows that if we refuse, he's isolated. Good, let him be isolated. It's not that simple. Maeve set the letter down and rubbed her eyes. She'd been up late the night before working on the quarterly accounts, and the fatigue showed, dark circles, a slight tremor in her hands when she lifted the coffee cup. She was not a machine, no matter how much the town sometimes treated her like one. She was a woman who worked too hard and slept too little, and carried the weight of 14 ranches on shoulders that ached at the end of every day. Gull still controls 20,000 acres and a significant portion of the county's grazing land. If he goes hostile, truly hostile, not the petty sabotage we've been dealing with, he could restrict access routes, block water rights, tie us up in court for years. He's weakened, but he's not powerless. So what do you want to do? She picked up the letter and read it again, slower this time, the way she read everything, looking for the language underneath the language, the intent behind the words, the trapdoors and hidden clauses that men like Gull embedded in every communication. I want to make a counteroffer, she said. Not a partnership, a customer relationship. Gull joins the cooperative as a member, same terms as everyone else. Per head fees, shared costs, equal representation, no special position, no revenue share, no veto power. He'll never accept that. It puts him on the same level as Sarah Breck and Calvin Doss. That's the point. Colt looked at her across the kitchen table. The same table where she'd first shown him the ledger numbers on their third night as a married couple. The table where she'd mapped the pasture rotation and planned the cattle drives and built the cooperative one letter and one contract at a time. And he felt the familiar sensation of being outmaneuvered by his own wife, except that now it didn't bother him. Now it felt like being on the right side of something. Send the counteroffer, he said. Gull's response arrived a week later. It was one sentence: I accept. Maeve read it, set it down, and went back to the quarterly accounts without celebration. Colt expected something more. Satisfaction, at least. Maybe a small smile. Some acknowledgement that the man who had orchestrated their arranged marriage as a power play had just submitted to the terms of the woman he'd considered a pawn. That's it? Colt asked. He caves, and you just go back to the books? The books are what matter. The books are how we got here, and the books are how we stay here. You could take a minute, just acknowledge it. Maeve looked up at him, and there it was. Not the composed mask, not the ledger column calm, but the real Maeve. The one who had cried on the porch and walked 2 miles through the dark with a rifle and fallen asleep at the table with a pencil in her hand. She smiled, and it was the unguarded smile he'd first seen by the campfire when Lila made her laugh, wide and real and carrying all the history of a woman who had spent her life being told she was nothing and had decided quietly and without fanfare to prove otherwise. Okay, she said. 1 minute. She closed the ledger, leaned back in her chair, and looked at the ceiling for exactly as long as it takes to breathe in and breathe out. And in that breath was everything: the biscuits on the porch, and the feed calculations, and the dam, and the lawyers, and the salt, and the poison, and the river crossing, and the dead coyote on Sarah Breck's gate, and the $1,600 note, and the morning she told him not to pretend this was something it wasn't. Done, she said, and opened the ledger again. Colt laughed. He couldn't help it. He laughed the way you laugh when something is absurd and true at the same time, and Maeve looked at him with one eyebrow raised, and then she laughed too, and the sound of it filled the kitchen the way the rain had filled the creek bed, slowly at first, then all at once. The years that followed were not easy, because nothing real ever is. The cooperative grew to 23 ranches by the 3rd year and 31 by the 5th. Maeve hired a bookkeeper, a young woman from San Antonio named Alice Tran, who had graduated from a commercial college and could do double entry accounting faster than anyone Maeve had ever met, and gradually, grudgingly, began delegating some of the financial work that had consumed her every waking hour. You need to let go of some of this, Colt told her one evening, watching her review accounts that Alice had already reviewed. I'm not checking Alice's work, I'm checking the vendors. There's a difference. You've checked the vendors twice this week. Vendors bear checking. Maeve. She looked at him over the ledger, and the expression on her face was one he recognized from the early days, the controlled stubbornness of a woman who had survived by controlling everything and didn't know how to stop. What if I missed something, she said, and underneath the question was a deeper one that she'd never say out loud. What if I stop being useful? What if the thing that made me valuable disappears, and all that's left is the woman they laughed at in town? You won't miss anything, Colt said. And even if you did, it wouldn't be the end of the world. You've built something that can absorb a mistake. That's the whole point. She looked at the ledger for a long time, and then she closed it and put her pen down and folded her hands on the table. I don't know how to be someone who doesn't work all the time, she said. I've never been that person. Maybe start with dinner. Just dinner. No ledgers, no correspondence, no contract reviews. Just food and conversation like normal people. We're not normal people. No, we're not. But we could eat like them. They ate dinner that night at the kitchen table with the ledgers put away, and Maeve told him about her father, stories he'd never heard, about Desmond Holloway and his stubbornness and his bad jokes, and the way he'd read to her from agricultural journals when she was a child because they didn't have storybooks, and he thought she should know how soil works. She told him about her mother, who had died when Maeve was 7, and about the years of being the big girl, the awkward girl, the girl nobody invited to anything, and how she'd learned to fill the loneliness with numbers and letters and knowledge because those things never judged her and never looked away. Colt listened, and when she was done, he told her about his father, the drinking, the shame, the slow collapse of a man who couldn't understand why his ranch was dying. He told her about finding the old man in the barn one morning, still alive but barely, and the 2 years after that of watching him shrink and fade and apologize for things that weren't his fault, while the men who were actually responsible sat in their offices and counted their money. I used to be angry about it, Colt said. Now I'm just tired of being angry. It doesn't build anything, it just burns. You built something, Maeve said. This, us, the cooperative. You built it. I held the horse. Don't do that. Don't shrink yourself. You trusted me when nobody else would. You stood in front of Gull and said no. You drove cattle through a dust storm and a flooded river in a raiding party. That's not holding the horse, that's riding it. They sat in the kitchen with the dishes unwashed and the candle burning down and talked until the candle guttered out. And then they sat in the dark and kept talking. And it was the first time in their marriage that they had been simply together, not business partners, not reluctant allies, not two people clinging to the same sinking ship, just a man and a woman in a kitchen in the dark, telling each other the truth. The Mercer Ranch became the largest cattle operation in South Texas by the 5th year of the cooperative. Not the largest by land, Gull still held more acreage, but the largest by revenue, by herd count, by reputation, and by the only metric that actually mattered in the cattle business, reliability. When the Army needed beef, they called the Mercers. When the Houston packing houses needed consistent supply, they called the Mercers. When ranchers anywhere in the region needed a fair deal and honest accounting, they called Maeve. Not Colt. Maeve. The distinction mattered, and Colt was the first to say so. He said it at the annual meeting of the Texas Cattlemen's Association in San Antonio, where the cooperative had been invited to present its model to ranchers from across the state. The meeting room held 200 people, and when Colt stood up to speak, the room quieted the way rooms do when they expect something worth hearing. I'm going to keep this short, Colt said, because the person you should be listening to is sitting right there. He pointed at Maeve, who was in the second row with her journal in her lap, and an expression on her face that suggested she was going to have a conversation with him later about ambushing her in public. Everything you've heard about the cooperative, the contracts, the cost savings, the shared patrols, the feed networks, that's her work. All of it. Every contract, every number, every idea that nobody thought would work until it did. He paused, and the room was quiet, and he could feel 200 pairs of eyes on him, some skeptical, some curious, some hostile. He didn't care. 5 years ago, a group of powerful men in my county decided to solve 2 problems at once. They had a young rancher drowning in debt, and they had a woman nobody wanted, so they put us together and waited for us to fail. The whole county waited. They made bets on it. They made jokes about it. They made her life... His voice caught, just slightly, just enough to be real. They made her life harder than any person's life should be. And she took everything they threw at her, and she turned it into this. He gestured around the room, at the ranchers, at the cooperative members who had traveled from Dimmitt County, at the ledgers and contracts and documents that told the story of what Maeve had built. I didn't marry the right woman, I married the best woman. And if any of you are smart, and I think some of you might be, you'll listen to what she has to say. He sat down. Maeve looked at him for a long moment, and her eyes were bright with something she would never call tears because Maeve didn't cry in public. And then she stood up and walked to the front of the room and opened her journal and began to speak about feed economics and pasture rotation and cooperative governance. And she spoke for 45 minutes, and nobody moved and nobody laughed and nobody made a single joke about her appearance. Because by then the numbers spoke for themselves, and the numbers were louder than cruelty had ever been. Afterward, in the hotel lobby, with ranchers still coming up to shake her hand and ask questions about the cooperative model, Colt found Maeve sitting alone in a corner with her journal and a glass of water, looking the way she always looked after sustained social interaction, depleted, relieved, and already calculating something. "You ambushed me," she said. "I introduced you." "Same thing." "No, it's not. An ambush is designed to hurt someone. An introduction is designed to let people see who they're dealing with." She looked at him sideways. "That was a practice line." "I thought about it on the ride down." "How long?" 4 hours, give or take." She almost smiled. "You spent 4 hours preparing one sentence?" 3 sentences. And yeah, you prepare for months. I figure I can spare an afternoon." The smile came then, fully, the one he loved, undefended and warm and carrying in it all the years of being dismissed, and all the months of being tested, and all the hours of being bent over a ledger in a kitchen in West Texas, building something out of numbers and stubbornness, and the refusal to be what other people decided she was. "Take me home," she said. "I have accounts to review." "Dinner first? No ledgers." "Fine. Dinner first. But then accounts." "Deal." They walked out of the hotel together into the San Antonio evening, and people who didn't know them might have seen a tall young rancher and a big red-haired woman and thought nothing of it, and people who did know them knew better. They knew that the woman with the journal and the ink-stained fingers had taken a dying ranch and an impossible marriage and built from them a network that fed soldiers and supplied cities and gave 31 families a way to survive on land that tried to kill them every single day. Back in Carrizo Springs, the ranch house still had 4 rooms and a kitchen table scarred with pencil marks and coffee rings. The ledgers still lived on the labeled shelves. Wick still walked the property every morning with his bow-legged gait, older now, slower, but still there. Joaquin's ribs had healed years ago, and he ran the drive logistics with a quiet competence that Maeve trusted completely. Dutch drove the supply wagon. Lila came and went with the seasons, appearing when she was needed, as if summoned by some internal compass that always pointed toward the Mercer Ranch. And Maeve still sat at the kitchen table every evening with her journal and her coffee and her relentless, beautiful, exhausting brain, going through numbers that told the story of an empire built not on appearances or inherited power or the approval of men who thought they owned the world, but on the simple, stubborn, unglamorous conviction that a person's worth is measured by what they build, not by what they look like building it. The creek ran steady through the southeast quarter, clear and cold, feeding grass that fed cattle that fed families across 1,000 miles of Texas range. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the work was done and the books were closed and the sun was going down over the Mesquite Flats, Maeve would walk down to the creek bank and stand there, watching the water flow through land that had been dry for a decade before she came. And she would think about a porch in Eagle Pass and a plate of biscuits and a young man with a torn cuff who had looked at her the way everyone looked at her, with low expectations and lower curiosity, and who had learned slowly and imperfectly and with more stumbling than grace to see what was actually there. Not a joke, not a pawn, not an impossible bride, just a woman who knew how to count and who had counted on herself when no one else would.